All right, boys and girls, we are back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can email us, as always, at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. I'm happy to be joined today by someone who I'm sure you've read over the years, either at his own site of Cafe Hayek or in publications across the gamut of talking about all matters economic policy related. That's Don Boudreaux. He is a professor of economics at George Mason University. He's also a senior fellow at Mercatus and at the Fund for American Studies. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Happy to be here, Ben.
I want to talk to you about a number of different areas, but first I want to ask you a question about the level of confidence that you have in our leadership in a bipartisan fashion in this moment as it relates to coming back from this economic catastrophe, which is historically unique in so many ways. Seeing the types of shutdowns that have rolled across the world and that continue here in America, it's a new thing for people to experience. They're used to problems that come from Wall Street or from other areas of the economy. They're not used to ones that seem to be driven so much by government policy and mandated so directly. Given that, and given that we're speaking on the day when Joe Biden just rolled out the second portion of his economic plan, that we've seen the kind of economic plan to various vague degrees that President Trump is pursuing, how much confidence that we have in the leadership class of this country to lead us out of such a uniquely bad and odd moment in terms of our economic challenges?
I don't have much confidence at all. Now, you're talking to someone who for a long time has been, some people describe me as cynical about politics. I describe me as realistic about politics. I have, my disdain is bipartisan. Each party has done things at the national level, state level, and local level that I find disturbing. Mm-hmm. You rightly alluded to the reality that our problems today are very much government created. The COVID problem, not exclusively, of course. COVID is a real thing.
Yes.
But the reaction to it, in my view, and I've become more and more convinced by this, is vastly excessive. The same people who for years have displayed to me and to other sensible people at best a poor grasp of economics, a failure to think through the full consequences of their policies. Given that that's true, there's no reason to believe that in this case they suddenly became prudent and said, okay, let's think of this seriously, and let's think of all the angles of what will happen if we do this as opposed to doing that. No, they just shut down the economy as if wealth gets produced automatically without asking questions about how we're going to reopen it. What are the criteria for reopening it? The criteria change. It's now tried to say they've changed over the past few months. I see no reason to think that these same people who for years have spoken foolishly very often about economic matters have somehow become wise and deep in their understanding.
You have a piece at the American Institute for Economic Research that ran just yesterday, entitled "Who is Making Decisions About Our Lives?" We'll link to it. I think that the argument that you advance is very strong in the sense that it's showing the different gaps in knowledge that so many of these leaders have, and frankly, I think that they're very bad at recognizing the downsides of the decisions that they're making in anything other than short-term policy decisions. In other words, they don't see the type of damage that's being done to American small businesses when you close back down again, as California is doing this week, and you force all these folks to make decisions and determinations that will probably ultimately result in the deaths of a lot of businesses that had thought they had to hang on for a certain amount of time, but then find that that's not the truth and that they're facing completely different scenarios.
I agree completely. So again, these people don't really know. They've given evidence time and time again. They don't really understand how economies work. They don't understand where wealth comes from. Wealth is not just something, it's not a stock of stuff that's sitting out there in someone's vault or in Jeff Bezos's basement. Wealth has to be produced again and again, daily. And fortunately, we're a wealthy country. We've had a lot of stuff stored up in inventory. But at some point, when you block these processes, you can't just restart them in the same way you can flip. It's not flipping a light switch, you know. And then related to that, by the way, so you and this makes me more discouraged. You see how the government say, okay, we understand their problems, so we're going to pass stimulus bills, right? I'm a pretty strict libertarian when it comes to what the government should do. But even here, I say, okay, these are unusual times. I don't get too bent out of shape by emergency measures designed to give people emergency help. But the notion of stimulating, using stimulus spending of the sort that we used in 2008, 2009, the sort that we used in the early 1980s, and that's called for by Keynesian and monetarist economics, I think this is rather naive. You can't stimulate an economy if you're not allowing the economy to be stimulated. And by shutting it down, you're basically saying, we don't want you to be stimulated. And we're giving people money, giving them the impression that something is good will happen. But if the economy is not allowed to work, it's just money being created and checks being written, but you get no real outcome as a result.
The other thing that I find so irritating about this moment is that there are a lot of people who want to take the policies of this moment, where I think a lot of people, including myself and you, who would normally be very rankled by the idea of government stimulus, will acknowledge, look, this is a very weird scenario. Government's making decisions to shut down these companies. They need to be able to tide themselves over in some way. So we can't, necessarily expect that. They want to turn that into, well, this should be permanently the way that we ought to run the economy. We ought to have these types of stimulus checks going into people's bank accounts, on a regular, bi-monthly basis, just to supplement everything that they're already making. They want to turn this into an argument in favor of a permanent approach that would be madness in terms of the kind of debt that it would represent, wouldn't it?
That's exactly right, and you're exactly right to call it madness. A good analogy would be is as if you have a patient that's in distress, and you put the patient in an ambulance, and you give the patient emergency medical treatment. You say, look, it's working, and it does work. You say, oh, so let's just have this person on emergency medical treatment for the rest of his or her life.
I think unfortunately you just described the opioid epidemic.
Well, the country has a lot of problems, and unfortunately, one of these problems that we have politicians that don't understand really the way the economy works, and they play to popular prejudices, they play to popular misunderstandings. That's what gets them elected. That's what gets them votes. I get it from their own individual perspective, but it's really unfortunate because I think the damage being done to the economy now is it's unprecedented in my lifetime. And I'm a bit, if you look closely, I'm a few months older than you, and
a little bit.
I'm 62, and nothing like this has happened, and I didn't think I'd ever live to see this. And
is this going to create kind of a generational pit in terms of the economic hopes for people who are, just right now emerging from college, maybe we're headed to their first job, in the summer or the fall, we're starting their career and had to be feeling, back in January or February, a lot of optimism, a lot of hope, given the economy at the time. Is that just all scattered to the wind?
Your guess is as good as mine. I have a sense that I don't think it's all scattered to the wind. I have learned over the years that the market is really robust, and it can come bouncing back, but that doesn't mean it's indestructible. And so I think a lot, I don't think anything's cast yet, the die isn't cast. And so we can still pull ourselves back from the brink, but we don't have forever to do it. I have a 23-year-old son who will soon, in a few years, he's in graduate school now, he'll enter the job market. And until, March, I was very optimistic about his future. I was quite sure he would grow up in a world even better and more amazing than the amazing and wonderful world that I grew up in, for all of its faults. It's amazing and wonderful. And I was sure he would have the same. I am no longer, I am sorry to say, sure that when he is my age, that his world will be not only not better than my own, but I'm not even sure it's going to be as good as the one that we have today.
One of the concerns that I had at the beginning of this process, and I expressed it to a friend of mine a couple of times, because he was worried about the backlash that various lockdowns would create. And I said that I actually had the opposite fear, which is that Americans have grown too comfortable and sedate and too willing to accept government mandates, even to their own severe detriment as it related to the economy and other steps. And I see that now continuing to be, the case in terms of not just America's leaders not trusting the people, but people not trusting their neighbors, to behave responsibly, to act according to, to what they've been learning and everything else. You look at these states, for instance, that never locked down and that experienced, far less of an outbreak, at least to this point, than other states that did. And one of the things that you can detect is that people started naturally, distancing, going to fewer events, not going out to eat, making determinations for themselves based on what they know. And yet, today, again, the situation in California, the calls for a national mandatory mask requirement, something that I think would be fundamentally unconstitutional, for instance, but something that is endorsed and favored by a lot of people. How can we get people back to the point where, something that's been, I think, true of most of American modern history, where we have more faith in our neighbors and less of an urge to say, government, come in here, you've got to order this thing, because otherwise we can't take care of ourselves?
Oh man, you asked the 64 trillion, a few years ago, $1 billion question, $1 trillion question now. I don't know, but that is exactly the right question. We as private citizens, we as individuals, we as neighbors, we as family members, we as business people, as consumers, we're not the dumb clucks that the political class make us out to be. Of course, we don't make perfect decisions. But show me a politician who's ever made a perfect decision. And this is a gigantic country. People have different preferences, and there is no one size fits all. There is no solution. There are trade-offs, as Thomas Sowell, the great Thomas Sowell, always says. And when what's a good trade-off for you is different than what's a good trade-off for me. And the best possible approach is as much as possible. It's not always possible. As much as possible to let individuals choose how to make their own trade-offs. So to go about mandating things nationally, as if what is an appropriate approach for elderly people in Manhattan is the same as it will work for college-age students in South Dakota. It's just ridiculous. But I was surprised, Ben, in looking back at it, and I gotta say, I was surprised at myself, not pleasantly, at how sheepish we Americans were when the lockdown orders came. I was just told lockdown, okay, well, we'll just lock down. I didn't like it, but I'm not sure what I would have done. My school went online, so that's when I wound up teaching. But we Americans, we just said, okay, we'll all go under house arrest for a few months. How to recover that? How to recover the sense of independence and appropriate skepticism of government? I'm not saying hostility to government, but appropriate skepticism of look. We do have a certain realm of personal responsibility that we should not allow the government to trample on. How to recover it? I don't know. If I did, I'd write a book right now and save the world.
For all the concerns that are advanced in the media about rebelliousness and populist revolt, my concern has actually been that we're too docile as a people.
Lately.
The situation you mentioned, your own experience at university, the situation right now that seems to have enormous import to the American economy is the question of reopening schools. And certainly what we've seen from Europe and from other parts of the world is very hopeful in that regard, that particularly young children, not only do they not seem vulnerable to this, but they seem to not spread it, that at least for K through sixth grade and potentially for beyond that, there's very minimal proof of anything along those lines. And yet that seems to be a real flashpoint that's become essentially a partisan issue. We have outreach from folks who read us at the Federalist, and in fact, we published a piece today from a California-based family who is in a Democratic community in the Bay Area. They're Democrats. They say this is the first time they've ever agreed with President Trump about anything as it relates to reopening schools. Why? I understand the partisan nature of this.
Right.
But to me, when the science all seems to be on one side, and that side seems to be good news and seems to be news that would help primarily working class Americans who need schools and everything attendant to them because they can't afford childcare, they can't afford to have both one spouse staying at home to watch the children or afford that type of thing. Why is this becoming something that is such a flashpoint as opposed to being a good story about, hey, this is at least one aspect of normalcy we can bring back?
Yeah, I've wondered the same thing. I don't have a really good answer. I have suspicions, and so this is not the first thing I'm going to say is a surprise to no one, at least no one who listens to this program, and that is, public school teachers unions are incredibly powerful, excessively powerful, and a force largely for evil rather than for
Yes.
good. The government school system is basically run for them rather than for the kids. So when I see and hear, as I've heard and you've heard of the past few days, these vehement protests by public school teachers, well, we can't reopen because of this, that, and the other thing. My suspicions automatically go up that what's going on here is, they've given very little evidence that in the past they really care about children. They care about their own welfare much more than they care about the welfare of the pupils they teach. I suspect, I don't know exactly what it is, and that's all it is a suspicion. I suspect that it's better for them. They'll keep their pay, they'll keep their benefits, and they'll get to sit at home, and it's probably easier to teach. I mean, me as a college professor, I'd much prefer to be in front of my class, but there are certain things about it that are easier. I don't have to go to camp, worry about parking, about that, I just wonder. I was talking to a friend of mine earlier today who tells me that the public schools in Arlington, Virginia, have decided they're going to stay, shut down for the fall, and kindergarten is being taught online. How do you teach kindergarten? It's ridiculous. And so I think if somehow the pay of these public school teachers was threatened, they would change their tune very quickly. Suddenly, COVID-19 wouldn't be the great threat that they're presenting it to be now.
The government has sent more than $13 billion to the states since this began. That was targeted for the education side of things, which obviously is mostly K through 12. Very little of that money has been spent. I believe that the number is still less than 250 million or something like that.
Tiny,
It's tiny. And to me, it's like, is there any way to go back in and make that contingent on actually having to, go back to work? Because particularly for young kids, as you point out, Zoom's not going to cut it for them. That's not going to work. And we already know from evidence that they need a lot of structure, and that structure, when it breaks down, tends to lead them to having setbacks in their own learning experience. Obviously, kids are unique, but this is a scenario where I worry that we're going to have a lot of kids who suffer because of what is basically a partisan political position on the part of the teachers unions against reopening that just is not based on the science. And I'll tell you, if the science was different on this, I would have a different perspective.
Of course.
But when it seems so emphatic, I just don't get why people can't break out of their lanes a little bit and say, come on, I mean, this is something that we should feel good about. If in terms of the university side of things, I know that Harvard got some blowback for saying that they were going to go online teaching and keeping tuition at the same way. I've talked to a number of other folks who are in Ivy League schools, including some of our interns, and they are also seeing their tuition costs actually go up as opposed to coming down in any kind of deference to the online learning side of things. What do you think is going to happen to higher education because of the changes that we're seeing?
So there were changes that were happening before, and
Yes.
so this experience will speed up some things that otherwise would have happened. There was more of a movement to some online classes, and I myself have learned a lot more. I know a lot more today than I did a few months ago about how to teach using Zoom or Blackboard online, and it does have some features about it that in some ways are good.
Mhm.
But let's face it, at the college, it's not just about having information pumped into your brain. That's part of what goes on. But there's a whole collegiate experience. Kids want to be away from home. They want to be with other young people their age. It's part of a learning experience. It's part of an acculturation experience. Colleges perform that, and I don't think that we're going to get rid of that. One thing, it's all nested in a larger problem. Society cannot continue for long with people treating other people as if they are sources of poison. Stay away, keep a mask on, don't touch anyone else, be as far away and as alone as you possibly can be.
He's not distancing, she's not distancing, that kind of thing.
I mean, if society does survive that, it's going to be so fundamentally different from anything that anyone is accustomed to that it would be impossible for you or me to make any specific predictions other than it's going to be really different. We human beings are not equipped. We are a gregarious social species. We support ourselves by being highly specialized in what we produced and then trading with a bunch of other different people. That involves very often physical contact with people, being in front of people. Yes, more can be done online. We can have the delivery guy. We can have drones deliver lettuce to us if we want. But who wants to live just staying in your house with drones delivering your food to you and having your 6-year-olds being lectured at over Zoom? It's people are not thinking. This is trite to say, but I'll say it. It's not news to you, I'm sure, or to anyone who's listening. But there's something about social media, something about the way information is delivered today that has somehow enabled news about coronavirus and COVID-19 to grab a kind of attention that a similar kind of thing in the past would not have grabbed. Holman Jenkins at the Wall Street Journal, I don't remember his exact words, a few months ago, he said, at some point someone made a decision that Americans can die of anything, just not of COVID-19, right? You die of heart failure, die of automobile accident, but don't die of COVID-19. That's what we're going to care about. And I thought, okay, that's going to go away. It's going to go away. I don't see it going away. I just see this fear of this one thing without any context or perspective. It's very distressing. Very distressing.
I think it's very distressing. And I worry about the type of landscape that we would see in America socially in the world in which you talk about. We already see, we've seen in the past decade or so, what happened with delayed marriage, for instance, on the part of a lot of Americans. And you ended up with all of these guys basically living in sort of frat house type arrangements, communities, well into their 30s. You combine, the advancements in virtual reality, the drone delivery that you mentioned, throw in UBI and a couple of other programs that the left want to create mostly out of the various supplements here, and it's a recipe for a stagnant life where you're basically living in fear, and it's something that should be, I think, considered very un-American in terms of the way that we've approached life in the past. Maybe I'm exaggerating my level of concern. Maybe there's something human that gets us out of this, but I'm very worried about that and that sort of sedentary approach to living that, while more safe, also leads to less economic growth, less invention, less collaboration with others in a real human way. And frankly, it would be, from my perspective, a pretty dark experience.
I agree. You said at the very beginning, you said, this is unprecedented. I mean, things that, and unprecedented in a big way. And so making, any kind of predictions
Of course.
are difficult. But it's here's maybe a tiny cause for a little bit more optimism on your part. And this is coming from a newly minted pessimist. But these government programs, UBI, throwing money at people, magical monetary theory, all this stuff is not going to have this isn't going to be bad for the economy. It's not going to make it temporarily might make people feel richer because, I have this nice check from the government. But checks being sent by the government, the Federal Reserve printing money, that doesn't create food to eat. It doesn't create automobiles to drive. It doesn't create the ability to get your dryer repaired when your clothes dryer goes out. It doesn't create real goods and services. And so at some point, people are going to realize this. And maybe when people come to realize this, actions will emerge where people start demanding somehow that the economy be allowed to work more closely, in a way more closely akin to how it was working before all this nonsense occurred. But who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows?
I want to talk to you a little bit about America's economic relationship with China. Mm-hmm. It's a misnomer from my perspective to say that America has been experiencing free trade in terms of our relationship with China. Free trade to me is I put in the same category as people who talk about having a free market system in healthcare prior to the passage of the Affordable Care Act, ignoring Medicare and Medicaid and all the other government regulatory forces that come to play. And so you just have negotiated trade deals and things of that nature that can have good and bad aspects to them. The president has obviously upended the conversation about trade and did so. It's one of the few areas of politics where he's been consistent through his career. Joe Biden now is sounding very similar notes when it comes to the amount of government spending he wants to throw at various things, trying to win back a lot of those Rust Belt states where voters voted for President Obama twice, but then perhaps shifted in 2016. Is this a situation where we're going to basically have two candidates running for president in 2020, neither of whom is going to be sounding, a strong, argument for free trade as benefiting us, just given the politics of the moment and the way that Americans view China as having an outsized role in this trade discussion?
Well, the answer to your last question is definitely so. I mean, Donald Trump has been, he for 30 odd years, since the 1980s, I remember, he has been very consistent in his view about trade. On that matter, I think the man is sincere. I think he's deeply wrong. Yeah. But he has been consistent. He hasn't changed what he says. Joe Biden, on the other hand, I think he's just a typical politician. He has his finger in the wind. If he thought that that all Americans wanted free trade, a la Adam Smith, he would be a la Adam Smith. But now he senses that they don't, so he's Joe Biden version of Donald Trump. You're right. There isn't that much difference. I didn't see what he put out today, but I saw the thing he put out last week.
Most of today was about energy. But it's, to me, there just seems to be, it's a difference of how much regulation do you want, how much subsidy do you want, what do you want to subsidize, where do you want to throw the money? In that environment, I guess my question is, how do we get out of that and back to a conversation that holds up trade as being a positive good for the American people? And especially because I think people tend to think of it based on their feelings about our trading partners and about who's advocating for the deal, as opposed to getting involved in any of the intricacies of the deals themselves, unless as they directly impact their communities.
So how to do it? I spend a lot of my life trying to communicate about trade. It's what I do. I care about it deeply, almost obsessively. Mm-hmm. So it's been done in the past. So that if something has happened in the past, I assume it can happen again. But people fundamentally have a misconception about trade. They think that the purpose of trade with foreigners is to export more. Like the more we export, the better off we are. And that imports are the price we have to pay. Well, okay, we'll accept some of your imports as long as you allow us to export stuff. That's completely backwards.
Yes.
The purpose of trade is to get as much possible in exchange as imports, and exports are the price we pay. Right? If the Chinese, or any other foreign, were willing to send us goods, services, free of charge, right, and didn't want anything, I would say, great. They're impoverishing themselves. They're enriching us in the prospect. People will say, oh, you don't understand. We're losing jobs here. Again, not again, because I mentioned it here yet, but this is great. The great Frederick Bastiat from the 19th century pointed out that, well, look, the sun sends us really important light and heat every day and doesn't charge us a thing. And we're actually benefited by that. But of course, the Chinese and no other foreign, they're not sending us stuff because they love us, obviously. Right? They want something in return. And what they want in return are American-made goods and services either today or tomorrow. That's what they want. That's the only reason they're willing to accept our dollars in exchange for their exports. They're not selling us their exports because they want to accumulate monochrome pictures of dead American statesmen. Right? They want real goods and services from us. Americans don't understand that. I think also Americans don't understand how important trade has been to them. Right? There is a narrative, to use a word I don't like, but I'll succumb to it. There's been this story that's been told on the left. It's been told for the past 25 years. On the right, it is now being told increasingly. Donald Trump tells it. A lot of Donald Trump supporters tell it. And the narrative is this. The American middle class was doing better economically up until the mid-1970s. We hit the mid-1970s and the American middle class stagnates. Ordinary Americans today, we are told, are no better off economically than they were in 1973 or 1975. People on the left, Paul Krugman, Robert Reich, have been saying this again and again and again. The New York Times and Washington Post repeats it as if it is an established fact. And it's simply untrue. If you look at the data, it is untrue. In fact, it's wildly untrue. But it's said over and over again. Well, if you really believe that, right, then, if it were true, then there would be something wrong with the American economy. And then what do you point to? Well, it is true that since the mid-70s, our trade with the Chinese has increased. Our trade with other foreigners has increased. We've had some this is why the left tells the story. We had deregulation and tax cuts in the late 70s and 80s. That must be the reason for the problem. And so if Americans understood, if they actually had the facts, if they understood the role that trade has played in improving their well-being, their material well-being over the past 40 years, they would, I think, be more prone to be more suspicious of the kind of economic nationalism that is behind Trump's and now Biden's pleas for hunkering in and trading less with foreigners.
Mm-hmm. There's an aspect of this where, first off, I agree with your critique, obviously, of that type of approach. Where I think I part ways with some folks, I'm curious to get your perspective on this, is I'm more sympathetic to the argument that we've ignored some of the downsides of trade as it relates to importing the values of other nations. And I think a perfect example of that as it relates to China is the experience that has played out with the NBA and the way that, this American sports league basically has to bend the knee to the priorities of China, refuse to allow any of their players or of their workers to express any alternate, political views and the like, because they're worried about losing access to the Chinese market for things as little as, in the case of Houston Rockets, GM Daryl Morey retweeting an image expressing support for Hong Kong. The concern that I think a lot of Americans have is that, when we're importing these little plastic tchotchkes, I'm not worried about it. But when we start importing these other values, that's a problem, especially among these corporations that seem to, if anything, have values that actually conflict with what you would expect, how you would expect them to behave if the dollar really was their motivating instrument. In other words, looking at the behavior of a number of different American firms, I've heard people say, I feel like, they want to be American when it comes to certain things, but they don't want to be American when it comes to, their own political priorities or the things that are being driven out of their HR or communications departments, things like that. I worry that woke capitalism has done a serious damage to the capitalism part of that portion. If anything, a lot of the time, my attitude towards these things has typically been, well, I want you to just be more capitalist, because then you'll be more, engaged with selling to all customers and not going down the road of becoming essentially political actors. What do you think about that complex relationship, and how Americans are kind of accepting that this is something that's bad in different ways from both the left and the right?
So there's a lot there. Look, I agree with your statement about woke capitalism, and I cringe when I see corporate executives succumb weakly and mindlessly to the sensitivities du jour, whatever you call them. Mm-hmm. So getting back to the NBA, I think the Chinese leadership in Beijing is heinous, and it's terrible. And the Chinese people are the main ones who suffer from that. I mean, some of it spills over here, but they're the true victims. Mm-hmm. And so I hate the fact that the NBA did that, but I think I have two things to say about that. First is the NBA doing that. That's just one example of the larger class that you already referred to of capitalist leaders today, business leaders today, just rolling over childishly to all the sentiment. So yeah, in that case, the NBA responded to the Chinese government. All right, boo for them. I really dislike the fact that they did that, but I think that's just part and parcel of what these people are doing. They understandably, they don't want to lose their markets. All right, so yes. The NBA doesn't want to lose the Chinese market, so it comes down on the Houston Rockets general manager for criticizing the Chinese. Business leaders here, they don't want to lose their markets, and so they play the politically correct card by going along with all the woke crowds. Mm-hmm. That is a problem. I don't know how to solve that problem. I understand where it comes from. How to solve it, I don't know. But the second thing I want to say is about importing values. We live in this world of trade-offs, and so one of the greatest American value, or a great American value, is freedom and letting individuals make their own decisions. I don't like the fact that the NBA did that. I'm not that big of a basketball fan. If I were, I probably would probably cause me to pull back in my enthusiasm for looking at NBA games or attending NBA games. But I would not want America to say, okay, we're going to respond to that by restricting Americans' freedom to invest abroad or to buy things from abroad.
Sure.
So I agree with you. It is an issue.
The disturbing.
Go ahead.
The disturbing through line on that woke capitalism thing to me is you have this combination right now where all of these people who've gone through these training programs essentially in American colleges have come out learning a lot of things and maybe have certain animosity toward various folks in America, have moved from that student experience and that environment into human resources, into the corporate world, and have enormous influence about decisions that are made. For instance, I'm sure you're familiar with this boycott of Facebook, their advertising boycott that's been going on with a number of major American brands and corporations participating in it. Now, what was interesting to me about it is I just noticed in the last week that what they were claiming to support, or what they were claiming to advocate for to Facebook, was the Southern Poverty Law Centers changed the terms proposal from a few years back, which is a very harsh leftist document that includes basically things that would make posting, frankly, a lot of religious texts and Bible verses and the like be viewed as hate speech on the platform. I mean, they wouldn't be able to pass muster, and I'm pretty sure that doesn't even relate to some of the more controversial stuff. I mean, it could be something as simple as man and woman, he created them. Like that,
Yeah.
that might not work anymore. It could be viewed as hate speech. And I was surprised that, like, wait a minute, Coca-Cola is really signing on and saying that? That just, that doesn't pass muster to me. Shouldn't you just be about selling me sugary water? I was much happier when that's what the relationship was.
Yeah. The late great Joseph Schumpeter, wrote a long time ago that capitalism would destroy itself because precisely because of this. And, I for years said, okay, Schumpeter was wrong. And suddenly I think Schumpeter might be right. But, let's tie this to the discussion we were having earlier about the public schools. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the lousy education that Americans have been getting for the past few generations is partly responsible for this. Americans today seem to have no real understanding of history, right? They have this cartoonish version of history. They don't understand a context. They have no sense of historical proportion. The notion that the United States today is no less racist than it was 40 years ago or 140 years ago, or that somehow racism in the United States today is historically disproportionate. It's just ridiculous. Of course, America has problems. Of course, racism exists. It will always exist, unfortunately. But the United States today is among the most tolerant and inclusive nations ever in the history of humanity. And it's hugely ironic that some of the most intolerant people in the United States today are the ones who are criticizing the United States for being not inclusive and whose policies will make us less inclusive. And I think a lot of this comes from the fact that people do not get, they're just not taught how to think well enough. They're taught how to emote.
I worry that, there's one thing I wish that everyone can understand. It's that we have this enormous good fortune to be living in this country in the West at this time in the history of humanity, given that the bulk of the history of humanity is one of enslavement, of domination, of war, of destruction, of starvation and famine and pestilence and
misogyny.
Yes. And just rampant persecution of every variety. And it's like, can't we at least be a little bit happy about the fact that we're this fortunate? And instead people are like, things are worse than ever.
It is ironic, and it's in a way it's sort of I don't know what to call it. It's just other than ironic. So the better things get, this is like, this is a glass, 99% full. The better things get, it is true that the more visible are the harms and the faults that remain. And they are genuine harms and faults. And they stand out more because against the background, they're more visible. If you took all these woke people and you brought them back 300 or 400 years and put them in that society, all they would see is poverty and bigotry and prejudice and oppression. And it would be so common that you'd stop noticing it because it's all around. Now, what little exists, relatively little exists, they notice it. And on top of that, unfortunately, a lot of things that, because they don't understand economics, they don't understand history, a lot of things that they don't understand, they interpret as oppression when it's in fact not oppression. There is oppression today, but my gosh, it's so much less as a proportion of our daily experiences as it was throughout the most of human history. We are lucky, as you say, Ben. We certainly are.
Well, let's go out on this. One hopeful aspect of this to me is, we were talking at the beginning about, my own concern that people would not have, maybe a rebellious attitude, that they wouldn't trust their neighbors and fight for their own freedoms as much. One hopeful aspect of this to me is that there are a number of very basic and reasonable things that libertarian-minded or it's not even just that, but basically freedom-minded people have favored for a while, that I hope will endure beyond this moment. And I would include in that number, those who have already been thinking about homeschooling and maybe find that they actually like it. People who will view the regulations that are opposed to that as being something that needs to be wiped away more permanently. The regulations against the things that people can deliver to you, the regulations on the health side of things in particular, that prevent people from gaining access to potentially life-saving treatments and the like earlier in the process. I think this is going to wake people up to how long it takes to actually find vaccines and to go through the experiments involved. Are you hopeful in regards to anything in related to that?
I do think the things you identify, I think there will be some improvement on a lot of those fronts. Whether these improvements will outweigh the harm being done on other fronts is a separate question. But people do see that a lot of these occupational licensing regulations and regulations who can deliver what, and on the absurd lengths to which some companies have to go in order to get drugs approved. I think a lot of this is being exposed as harmful and detrimental. So I think some of that's going to go away, and that certainly would be a good thing. Greater acceptance of homeschooling. It is kind of ironic, right, that the public school teachers want children to remain at home and be schooled, but they're opposed to homeschooling, right? Well, so maybe this will have a better effect on an K through 12 education. But again, your guess is as good as mine, and I don't think either of our guesses are going to, at this point, really good, because this is such an unprecedented situation. What will the world be like 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Let's just keep our fingers crossed and hope for the best.
When we didn't know what the world would look like, 7 months ago, it's hard to run it out that far.
It's exactly right. No one would have predicted this. So,
Don Boudreaux, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Ben. Thank you.
I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.